I'm not sure we know that. We don't have any information suggesting that, well, I mean, nobody has modeled the quarry emissions. So we don't have any information that suggests that emissions from the quarry are going to go off-site. And the other thing to consider is that I think there's been an insinuation that anytime you have multiple sources in an area that you're going to have cumulative impacts. But the only time you have cumulative exposure is if the impacts from the multiple sources occur in exactly the same location at exactly the same time.
Now, you say we don't have much information on this emission from the quarry. Do you have any information establishing that crystalline silica will not be emitted from that quarry?
Again, my opinions are based on the air modeling, and the air modeling does not include the quarry. Neither side modeled the quarry, so I don't have any basis to express an opinion on what would be coming from the quarry.
So do you have any basis to express an opinion as to the impacts of this facility if one were to include the crystalline silica emissions coming from the quarry?
Well, all of my testimony relates to whether the maximum allowable emissions authorized by this permit affect public health or welfare. I definitely have a basis for that, but I have not contemplated sources that were not contemplated in the air dispersion modeling, other than to say that the procedure that was used here is the same procedure that was used in all permits. There's no permit where every single source in the geographic region has been modeled. That's exactly why we add background concentrations to the modeled concentration of the facility. And it's also part of the reason why the Texas FX screening levels are set at such remarkably low levels. They're set at especially low levels to leave a buffer for sources that were not specifically included in the model.
Now, if one were to want to determine the actual health impacts on people in the future around the facility, would one want to consider the total amount of those contaminants, say crystalline silica, that are going to be in the air that that person would be breathing?
Well, again, my testimony relates to the air permit application.
Well, I'm trying to look at reality and to look, and we do a health and welfare impacts analysis of this facility, trying to look at what's going to be the situation after this facility is permitted. And if we want to, I understand you're saying you've looked at modeling. I'm asking you whether a person breathing the air after this facility is permitted is going to be impacted by all of the different emissions in the area.
It depends. If the impacts occur at the exact same location, at the exact same time, and there's a person at that particular location being exposed, and if the concentrations are high enough to actually elicit an adverse effect, they might be, but we don't have any evidence to suggest that that's the case. The procedures that have been used here are extremely conservative from the modeling and also from the health impact levels that we use to evaluate the modeling.
Do we have any evidence here to demonstrate that that will not occur? That those types of concentrations from the various facilities will not occur together at the same location? And I say facilities, from the various facilities and sources. So looking at the quarry as a source of emissions as well as the rock crusher as a facility. Do we have any evidence that the concentrations will not occur? Concentrations of emissions from those two types of locations will not occur at the same spot?
Well, I think we have evidence, as Mr. Nohoff testified earlier, when he included the impacts of Mark Marietta, it didn't change the results at all. And the implication of that is that the Mark Marietta emissions are not reaching the plant. So I don't think we have any evidence that you're going to have co-located impacts, or at least not co-located significant impacts.
Well, I think we've discussed that there is going to be a quarry here at the same site as this rock crusher. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
So that's the Vulcan Quarry.
That's my understanding, yes.
And are the emissions from that quarry considered in the modeling that's been done?
They are not. My understanding is that quarries are specifically excluded from the definition of facilities, and the air permit covers the facility.
Are the emissions from quarries specifically excluded from the evaluation of the health and welfare impacts in permitting context?
I'm not sure if they're specifically excluded, but I do believe that the fact that they're excluded in the Texas Clean Air Act is a matter of law. I don't think that had they been included, the TCEQ would not have reviewed them.
And just to be clear, they're excluded from a facility required to be permitted to be particular. Is that accurate?
I believe that's correct.
And when we're even modeling or evaluating the impact of the air emissions from a facility, do we look both at the facility emissions and at your background concentrations?
In the case of criteria pollutants, yes, that is the case. That's why we add in the background monitoring data.
And in the case of trying to do a health and welfare analysis, would we also be interested in what your background concentrations of contaminants are?
Well, for the contaminants on which a health and welfare evaluation is conducted, for example, silica, there typically are not monitors that monitor silica on a regional basis. And so the way we address that is we use extremely conservative effect screening levels, and the TCEQ effect screening levels for silica are very, very conservative, and part of the reason why they are made so conservative is to allow a buffer so that if there are other sources in an area, you have room for contributions from them.
The argument object is non-responsive. I asked you whether you consider background concentrations.
Well, I'm going to overrule the objection for purposes of expediency, if nothing else. The witness is doing the best she can to answer, and I agree she may have gone outside the specific scope of the question, but for purposes of what your question was generally getting at, she was doing the best she could to answer it. That's all of the objection.
So, do the regulations or the statutes specifically exempt emissions from quarries as contributors to background concentrations of contaminants?
Well, if you could respell the question, you would say.
You've just discussed that part of the basis of your analysis is the fact that quarries are defined as not being facilities in the relevant statutes. Do I understand that to be your testimony?
That's my understanding, yes, they are excluded.
And as we look at those relevant statutes and regulations, is there anywhere where quarries are excluded as being a consideration in looking at the background concentrations?
Not that I'm aware of.
So would it be appropriate to consider those quarries in looking at background concentrations?
Well, had the quarries been modeled, I would have looked at them, but they haven't been modeled by either the applicants or the protestants, and so I was unable to look at those. I can only look at the constituents for which modeling is conducted.
So in performing your health and welfare analysis, did you make any independent determination of what sources or contributors to contaminants should be considered?
No, I did not, because for sources that are not specifically modeled, we rely upon the background concentrations to account for those. And then for constituents that are not criteria pollutants, we rely on the fact that the effect screening levels are
quantitative analysis specific to this project to evaluate whether the concentrations from, if you were to consider the other ones, would lead to an exceedance of the ESL?
I am not aware of any specific analysis, but what I can say is that there is a very large margin of safety between the modeled concentrations from the facility and the ESLs, and an even larger margin of safety between the modeled concentrations and the levels at which you would expect to have a health effect. And that large margin of safety leaves a lot of room for other contributions before you would expect to see any sort of adverse health effect or welfare effect.
Is that margin of safety there in part? Is that margin of safety in place in part to address potential impacts upon sensitive populations?
It is there partly to address impacts to sensitive populations, yes.
So as we begin to encroach upon that margin of safety, are we increasing the likelihood of an impact on sensitive populations?
Well, I guess I'm not sure what you mean by encroach upon the margin of safety.
So as I understand you, the ESL is set at a certain level that allows a margin of safety between your ESL level and the level at which you've shown impacts on people.
Correct.
And part of the purpose of that margin of safety is to allow for the fact you may have sensitive populations for which an impact may occur with lower than, say, what you would observe in the rest of the population.
Part of it is.
Part of it. And so as we move into that, as we have a concentration of a contaminant that begins to go above the level set in BSL, or remains below that you're providing a margin of safety from, are you beginning to increase the probability of an impact on sensitive populations?
So you lost me when you said when we have an impact that's above what?
So our ESL effect screening level is set at a certain number.
Right.
And as I understand you, there's a margin of safety because the number at which you would see what you're describing as an impact is a higher number.
Correct.
And so if we have a concentration that exceeds that ESL number, but is not yet exceeding this number for which there's a margin of safety, so the number at which you observe impacts in the studies, part of the reason for that difference is because you have sensitive subpopulations that may experience impacts before you actually get to this number that you're, the number that you're saying there's a margin of safety from.
Well, that's not really what I said. I mean, often the number itself at which we observe health effects is based on the sensitive subpopulation. I mean, many of these studies are done with asthmatics, some of them are done with elderly individuals.
Is the number for crystalline silica based upon consideration of sensitive populations?
It has safety factors that account for that, yes.
And was one of those safety factors this margin of safety between the ESL?
It's included in the margin of safety.
Do you have the administrative record of there available